You have a right to be tired. You have a right to be upset. You have a right to be scared. You have a right to be angry. You have a right to rest when all of those things are happening. You don't have the right to quit. I've always been one that was like, I'm not throwing rocks at the giant. I'm going to be the giant on the inside, and I'm going to change hearts. There is the need for throwing the rocks at the giant, but that can't be our only tool in the tool belt.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Taking Her Lead. This is Joshua Everett Mayer.
And this is Trace Kerr. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking to Angela Jones. She is the Chief Executive Officer of Washington STEM. And just to give you a little bit of background, Washington STEM is a statewide nonprofit, and it advances excellence and innovation and equity in science, tech, and engineering and math education for all Washington State students. And I got to tell you, Angela was a joy to talk to, and it was just a great conversation.
She has had a varied career, ascending to being the CEO for Washington STEM. Much of her career spent in education, some in higher education. She brings just a wide range of experiences to bear as the CEO, and you'll hear her describe some of her thoughts on her career and things that she thinks are very important as a woman in leadership, as a woman of color in leadership. This is a very informative and fun discussion. So without further ado, this is episode 9, Angela Jones. Here we go. Angela, welcome to Taking Her Lead.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
How have you been?
You know, it's been an interesting week, and you guys know that. Just an interesting week in America. And so this conversation is just sort of a welcome respite.
Good.
When you can talk and reflect about things, I think it's always helpful.
Yeah, especially with changing to on because we're over in Spokane. We've just jumped into phase 2. And
right. Well, I think the governor's coming on around 2 or 2:30. To talk about moving into phase 2. The numbers have looked really good in King and Snohomish counties. So, but you know, after me being really sick, I'll be honest, I'm just not in a hurry.
Right.
I can understand in terms of the economy and people's businesses being impacted that, you know, folks want to be able to open as safely as possible. And I totally get that.
Should we talk about what you do?
Yeah. I do a lot of things. No,
I like to garden and
Totally. I actually totally do garden. When I think about that, I'm defined in many ways. I love being a mother and I love being a daughter. So there's a huge part of my identity. And I love the fact that I get to be the CEO of Washington STEM. And they're not totally separate because I think about impacts on the work that we do for my son, as well as for my grandchildren. I have 2 grandchildren. And so with Washington STEM, I actually have only been in this role for about 10 months now. I was vice president at Eastern Washington University before this. And, you know, I saw this job description and I wasn't looking for a job. I loved my job at Eastern, but there was a lot of talk about equity and helping different student populations get access to quality education, quality STEM education, and in particular girls, students in rural communities, students of color, and students living in low-income environments. Yeah. But and you see that a lot in certain jobs, but the piece that really stuck out to me was in the job description. It said that they wanted to make sure they could help Washington students compete and get jobs that allowed for family-sustaining wages. And I had never heard it stated in that way. And so I was fascinated, like, oh, now this is different. This isn't just about surviving. This is about thriving in the state of Washington. And so we focus on STEM education because as we're looking at data in terms of the job sector, the largest amount of growth, you know, is in the STEM sector. So science, technology, engineering, math, all things related to those. And then the types of jobs that allow for someone to have a family and to own a car and to buy a house. Those types of wage levels we tend to see related to STEM fields. And I mean STEM in the broadest sense of the word. So even folks who decide like, I want to be an electrician, or I want to be a steam fitter, or I want to be a plumber, not just like computer science, engineering, doctor, nurse. So that's what my team and I help communities figure out, how we make sure that STEM education is accessed by all kids. Because in many places, it's just recently that kids have to take computer science, for example. You probably remember back in the day, I had to take typing. That was the technology of the time, right? And now the computer, in some way, shape, or form, even if it's just your phone, that's still a computer. I always tell people the gas pump is actually a computer. So wanting to make sure that people have some basic skills, and now all schools have that requirement, but that wasn't always the case. So how do we continue to make sure that every kid, kids in, just north of Spokane who don't have broadband,
right?
How do we help make sure they're not falling behind in the way the world is moving?
Wow. So how do you make sure that those kids in the smaller, I mean, like it said on the website, 660,000 students across the state. How do you make sure that those small communities are keeping up in some way?
So we actually have 10 networks. So I have 20 people on staff, and like I said, we're based out of Seattle. And from there, we really look at the whole system of the state of Washington, education, business sector, all of those, but we partner with 10 networks. So in Spokane, for example, we partner with the Spokane STEM Network. We provide them some base funding, but their backbone organization is GSI. And so GSI is where they're housed. The reason we wanted to do that with networks is because your communities know what you need the most. We go in and we do provide data support, technical assistance. We love data, so we can help, sense making with data and make sure that, the average person can understand and use the data as you're making hiring decisions, or even as a university makes decisions on what majors do we offer, like what does Spokane need? So we provide a lot of data and dashboards, open source data for communities. And like I said, we've got 10 across the state of Washington. And then we do that work directly out of our Seattle office for the King County, Puget Sound area.
Wow.
But really looking to the folks in that area to say, as you're working with your chambers of commerce, as you're working with your high schools, and you're working with your, different corporate sectors, what is it you think you need? And now, what, we're going to show you the data, and we're going to figure out what the action steps are.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's huge. Just a question about the breadth of the populations that you guys work with, especially special needs, those in medical facilities, those in correction systems, foster. Do you have an approach for them that's different? Are you guys addressing that?
There are actually different approaches for different student populations. And that's why we partner on the ground with people who do direct services. So for example, there are some organizations that provide support to, like you mentioned, foster youth, right? There's others that provide support to immigrant populations. We often offer technical assistance and funding support. We have what we call catalyst grants, which are just basically investments in the community. That it doesn't have to be our networks that get those grants. Any organization, even outside of our networks, can apply for those grants to help them move that work forward. For example, there is one that's specifically focused on girls of color in the Seattle urban area, and doing in-school activities and after-school activities to try to promote it, not necessarily like traditional in the classroom kinds of things. We don't really, I was trying to think, I don't believe that we have worked with like the, students who might be in juvenile detention or anything like that. I don't believe that we have done that work yet. More so on K-12 early learning. So, we know a lot of kids come to kindergarten already behind in math and literacy. And so trying to work as well with daycares and places that just, they don't have preschool. There's a lot of places in the state of Washington that actually don't offer preschool. They don't have those slots. So it's been more of that birth through K-12 pipeline. And we're just starting really to figure out how to work with universities. And then with the community groups, like I said, foster populations, homeless populations, one I didn't mention, and immigrant populations, but not yet like the juvenile justice system yet.
Can you talk a little bit about your pathway into the different leadership positions that you've had?
It was definitely not a straight line. It is an absolutely insane journey that all makes sense now. Because I actually started out, I wanted to be a teacher. Actually, no, let me take it way back. I wanted to be a microbiologist. And this will sort of explain why I'm sitting in this seat now. I actually got a scholarship as a high school student to attend what was called the Summer Minority Apprenticeship Science Program at WSU.
Wow.
To spend 3 months working in a lab with the microbiology team at WSU in Pullman. And so I went, I fell in love. We were doing research to try to stop, it was amazing, to try to figure out how to prevent tapeworms in animals. And so absolutely gross and absolutely amazing all at the same time. Like I got to dissect a tumor and take tapeworms out. Like,
ooh, that's gross.
It's totally gross and totally intrigued me. And I went to college to be a microbiologist, and I couldn't get through the chemistry series, and I quit. I didn't have the science background. I fell in love with it through applied learning and didn't have enough of the background to get through college. I tried tutors, I tried all these things. So I decided then my first love was, being an English teacher. That's what I wanted to be. And so that's what I actually set out to be, which I only did for a year. And it's not that I didn't love it, but then higher education came calling, and they're like, we want you to help us recruit multicultural students to universities. And I did that. And then I got recruited away to be a fundraiser and then be an alumni director. I mean, things that made no sense. Like, and then after fundraiser, I became Spokane Public Schools Director of Employment and Equity Services. So I did that for 6 years. And then it was like, I think I want to go to law school. I'd always wanted a doctorate. So at the age of 41, I quit my 6-figure job, and I spent 2 years in law school at Gonzaga. And I cried a lot during those 2 years of law school, because you think you're super smart, and then you go into law and you're like, wait a minute, I don't understand this. And I got through, and then the trajectory shifted again. I thought I was going to be an attorney after law school. I accepted a job. I was going to be an assistant attorney general for the state of Washington. And then I became the chief of staff at Eastern Washington University. And then I became a vice president. And I loved all those jobs, but I also got frustrated. Think like I have all these crazy experiences. What does that mean? And then I get this job, and I went, oh, now every single thing I've ever done makes sense. Now I can understand every piece of my organization. So I've run HR. I've had oversight of marketing. I've had oversight of, college units like financial aid and housing and all of those. I've tried to be a science student and failed at it. And now sitting in this seat at Washington STEM, with every single one of those things mattered to shaping how I lead now and why I push the way I push. So finally it was like, oh my gosh, okay, I'm not totally insane. Maybe a little insane, but not, because the journey didn't make sense. I'll be honest with you. It didn't make sense.
Yeah, but you were gaining all these different perspectives in a way that someone with a single focus career, I don't think would have. Oh, of course not. Yeah.
But I couldn't see that until I sat in this chair and went, oh, I've done that.
I'm not a hot mess. This makes sense now.
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. And look, only for the last 10 months do I realize I'm not a hot mess. Absolutely. Yep.
I've had a couple of different careers, and at times I've been frustrated as well. Gosh, why? Because I have friends who they became a plumber, and it's been 25 years and they're still a plumber, and I get jealous of that. But now Tracy and I are working on this podcast where we're talking to so many different people, and I can speak a little bit of the language of most of our guests. So it's like
it makes sense.
I was at WSU, and my plan was to be a veterinarian, and I could not hack the math.
Yes.
And practical experience, I interned at a zoo, and I worked for the Seattle Aquarium, but that math piece, I just could not do it. And I think, if I'd had more or a different experience as a student, like a high school and a middle school student, maybe.
Right. It begs the question of what math is actually needed.
Yes.
So that's the conversations we've been trying to have. You could already do a lot of the things.
Yeah.
But we couldn't get through the academics. And it's like, but do we need that math? Or is there a different math that we could use that actually makes sense for you being a veterinarian?
Yeah. Which is an interesting question, right? Because it's like, you have to have some sort of rigor in order to do things. But yeah, to go, well, gosh, I just worked in a clinic this weekend and I did all the things that you need to be able to do, but I can't pass this class. And so I can't actually have a degree in this.
Yeah.
Right. And I really espouse, like, how do we integrate it so it actually makes sense? Like, you didn't sit in your work at the aquarium and go, right now, I'm only using my math
Yeah.
skills. And right now, I'm only using my English skills. And so, I try to talk to people like, how do we integrate that? Like, my son thrives. He's fortunate enough in his middle school to have a STEM program. And he thrives in that program because it's project based, right? He's writing a little bit, he's creating something, he's failing fast and trying it again, but he's using every subject area. He's using math, he's using science, he's using English to write, and it's technical writing, but he's using it. So, I wish we could do more of that. And I wonder why every kid can't have the experience that my son has the privilege to get.
Yeah. North Central High School here in Spokane has an amazing STEM program.
Yes, I've toured it.
Yes. Well, my youngest child is part of it. They were like class number 3, and now they're a sophomore in high school. And the fact that my youngest kid is going to graduate probably with published science papers.
Wow.
Is so amazing. And I say the same thing all the time. Why can we not have this in other schools? Why, it's so frustrating to have this opportunity simply because of where we chose to buy a house.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's what we're trying to figure out, how we get past those barriers, because I have toured your student school.
It's better than colleges.
I went and interviewed, like, I was just trying to talk with those kids, and I'm like, okay, I can't even keep up with this conversation anymore. And the tools they're using, the machines they're using are true machines in current companies.
Yes.
But that's not old machinery that they're practicing on. And so you're absolutely right. How does a kid at Rogers High School, because I know that right now, if you can get your kid there, right?
Yeah, because it's a lottery. But but then that's 60 kids, that's 70 kids out of, what is how many kids do we have in Spokane?
Right.
It's a tiny percentage of kids that have the opportunity to participate in something like that.
Well, you just gave a great example of why we do what we do.
Right.
Angela, can you comment on access to this kind of learning and the barriers, if there are specific barriers that girls and young women have to deal with?
I actually, I won't just share my thoughts. I'll share with you. I've actually talked to some young girls. I was actually interviewed by my high school newspaper.
Oh, fun.
And when I went in, I was excited. It was just 2 young ladies, and they said, we're actually part of the STEM program. My high school, Mount Lake Terrace High School, has been a STEM school for a while. And what they talked about was the challenges, because they want to be in these classes, but if there's 26 kids in the class, they're typically the only 2 girls. Ugh. And it's they've tried to get other girls, and people have said, well, it's not cool, to do STEM. And so they're trying to bring excitement. And so, one of the things I talked to them about is, we need to talk about STEM differently. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm pretty sure every teenager is addicted to their cell phone if they have one. And I said, that is a product of STEM. That cell phone doesn't happen without STEM. You are holding a computer in your hand. And they're like, well, we didn't think about it that way. I said, all the apps that you're using on there is STEM, and I said, and if that doesn't resonate with people, I love wearing lipstick and lip gloss. Well, the lady at the MAC counter that I love to buy from did not make that. That was made by a chemist.
Yep.
Before it got there, whether they pick the color palettes or how long it stays on your lips, like science has done that. And I said, and I'm pretty sure everybody likes indoor plumbing, and they like flipping a light switch. I think being able to go to the bathroom in your house and turn on your lights is cool. And they just said, well, we've never thought about explaining it that way. So I said, to help people think about, it's just everyday things that we want to try. Like, you don't have to have that same conversation about business and finance, right? People get it. You either want to deal with money or you don't. But most people want to deal with money, and they want to understand basic concepts related to money. So that's why I believe everybody should understand basic concepts related to our different STEM programs, because it's part of our everyday life. That's just the way we're going with this technology era.
So it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about is relevance, making the content
Yes.
and the direction relevant to these kids. Is there a relevance hurdle that girls have to deal with that boys don't have to deal with?
Right. And, even in college, when I was vice president for student affairs, I would meet with students a lot, and I would have, female students come to me and say, I had my chemistry teacher or my math teacher ask me why I was in this class, that it was, too hard for me, things like that. And so having to figure out how we change that culture that says that STEM is for males, and that's a huge culture shift. And I've talked to employers too, and just said, once we get, females or even people of color, right, to your work environments, what are you doing to actually change the work environment so every single one of your employees feels welcome there? And that's something, I've done so many keynotes, and people ask me all the time, like, Angela, we're losing our women and we're losing our staff of color. What do you say we should do about it? I'm like, I'm going to point this back to you. Have you figured out why you're losing them? Have you asked them, what's the work culture? What are the human resources, policies, and protocols that you need to re-examine? What are the interview questions they even have to get through to even get into your work environment? And so, looking at it from, as young girls, there's research that the UW has done that shows that girls opt out of STEM fields at about 5th grade.
Wow.
And so I think that relevancy thing Joshua mentioned is key to try to keep them going and say, this isn't just for, boys, this is for anybody who's interested, in these fields, because we need folks to come behind us and get excited about how we continue to help support the infrastructure of civilization is really what we're talking about when you say STEM.
Yeah.
When people want to just think about civil engineering, it's all of it.
So I have a question, because that 5th grade piece of kind of losing, I don't know if it's losing interest or feeling like they can't handle it. I used to do a lot of science demos in elementary schools, and the teachers, who were by and large female, were always saying, and sometimes even in front of the class, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Science is just so difficult."
Oh, yeah.
And I just want to be like, no, come on, we're here, and I've got a hairdryer and I've got a ping pong ball, and I'm going to talk about air pressure, and we're going to make it exciting.
Yes.
And I kind of wonder if we're not educating our educators to be excited about STEM fields in a way that incorporates it and makes them comfortable enough to talk to students about it.
I think you just hit the nail on the head with the word comfortable.
Mm.
And so you just hit something that's near and dear to my heart. Because I was always told it's okay that you struggle in math, it's hard. And I developed that mindset. So when I was pregnant with my son, I told my husband at the time, when he is born, we will never say to him that math is hard. We will never make that okay. And I said, the reason being, we would never say to him, and we'd never say to anybody, it's okay that you can't read or write. Reading, writing is hard.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
that's not okay.
Right.
We're like, oh, we can't have illiterate people, but we're okay with not having math or computer science literate people. And why is that? And so I think you're right that we have to demystify, science. I've seen some of those demonstrations like you're talking about, Trace, and they're so amazing. And I've seen like the Pacific Science Center here in Seattle.
Yeah.
I went to one of their programs at an elementary school and was like, oh my gosh, they literally just broke down every aspect of engineering in a way 4th, 5th, and 6th graders can understand. And it was amazing. And I think in a way teachers can understand. So you're right, making it comfortable, because I really believe that they should be able to integrate that even through in their elementary school day.
Oh, of course. I mean, and it doesn't take long.
They're doing it all the time. No, at all. So you're absolutely right about comfort. And I don't want to put that accountability solely on teachers.
Right.
I'm also going back to universities and saying, you guys are actually the ones that teach the teachers.
Right.
So what does your curriculum look like? And is it in sync with what our kids in 2020 and beyond actually need? And right now, I'd say the answer is no. Like, no disrespect, because I was part of that organization K-12 for years and years. But we have to do some things differently if we want to get to goal, with our kids being literate in many things.
There has been a shift more recently within education toward inquiry-based teaching through every subject, problem solving, and setting kids up with this curiosity rather than rote memorization, but really the problem solving piece. So it sounds like partly what you guys are doing is introducing those concepts that, hey, this is relevant, this is real, this is in the world, and you can develop problem-solving skills that allow you to navigate this.
Yes. And we actually give them, as much as I don't like to focus just on like toolkits, we do fund some of those through a program called LASER, which is around science reform. And so we do that across the state. We hold workshops to try to help teachers figure out how to integrate science in a different way into the classroom. And, Joshua, a while back, you had mentioned special education students. And this is near and dear to my heart because my niece was born with hydrocephalus.
Okay.
And we've never limited her. We don't let people limit her. And so she's gifted and talented in music and technology. That is her jam. And so when people ask me about, services to students, I always tell them let's be clear. These are students who are receiving special education services. It does not mean that they are not gifted in STEM fields.
Now you're speaking my language.
Yeah.
But what it means is we may be a barrier that we're not offering it. So
yeah.
When I was, working for the school district, one of my schools decided they wanted to have a math and special education teacher. They did team teaching. And then I was told by the state that I had to stop them from doing that. And I was like, why? And they were like, well, those are special education students. So those are students receiving special education services. And their primary teacher is a special education teacher, but the math teacher is helping, and these kids are excelling. So I'm not going to stop. But I didn't stop because I was like, they're going to have to come over here and make me stop because it was good for kids. So it's things like that we are the barriers for kids. Right? The system, because my niece, she hacked into my phone. I'm like, I have a passcode. And she hacked into my phone and took a video of herself. She can listen to music one time and play it on the keyboard.
Oh, wow.
She has talents in different places.
Yeah.
But I think that's where, because we build these constructs, we try to put how they learn into these different constructs. And I think oftentimes these systems we build are the barriers, which is why I do love project-based learning as well. And so we have some schools that do that. And where Trace's student is at North Central, they take on these research projects and they learn through that. Now you got me on my soapbox.
That's a good soapbox.
I know. Yeah. Because we do tend to ignore the 2E kids, that you're exceptional and that you can be, I really hate the word gifted, but, that you can have a reading disability and you can also be exceptional in something else in a different way. And when we're trying to make, it's difficult, right? The things that we want to have happen are expensive and difficult. And that's tailoring learning to students in different ways. Like you said, you have different crews of people all over the state because you know what your kids need.
Right. We don't want to come and it's like, we're Washington STEM. We're a bunch of scientists and academics, and let us tell you we're going to solve your problem. We're like, no, we don't know the communities. Yeah. So I'm pretty passionate about how do we do this differently? And you're right. It is, I guess to me, it's like, it's only expensive if we're doing this as an add-on and we're not actually changing how we do things. Because there's a lot of money. I always tell my teams, if I have a multi-million-dollar budget, don't ever tell me we don't have money. It means we have to stop doing something, right? We have to do something. We have to choose to try something different. And that can be scary. It can feel risky, but we've been using the same education system for a really, really long time. So what are we going to be willing to stop doing to try something new? Because what I find challenging is a lot of times our networks have to do things outside of school. And it's like, wouldn't we be stronger if we could partner with school systems and bring the resources we have to school systems and say, you know what, we know we're asking you for a lot, to be all things to all people, so let us help you. So those are some of the conversations we're trying to have right now with the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. Like, you have a heavy lift right now in the midst of this pandemic. how can we help? We have so many education nonprofits out there. We have skill sets, and I've told them, like, this is like that scene at the end of Endgame, right? And COVID-19 is Thanos. COVID-19 is not the education system; it's Thanos, and we all need to come together. You choose which Avenger you want to be, but we all need to come together and fight COVID-19 and make sure that our kids don't just survive through this, that they really continue to move forward.
Speaking of superheroes and superpowers, I love what you're talking about with regard to really special abilities, and that kids with what we've traditionally called disabilities have special abilities. They have things to bring.
Right.
What are some of the components that girls, and particularly young women moving into leadership, bring that other people don't bring?
It's interesting. Again, I try to base some of these things on research versus my opinion. Because I don't want to just make all these generalizations just because I get a chance on the mic, right? And so I actually, again, have talked to the University of Washington because I wanted to know, like, what is the research showing? And they're a research one institution. They've studied everything known to man, and so they talked about, and this was a specific study for engineering, that what they have found in their research is just that men and women problem solve differently. And that's okay. It's the problem, though, is if you only have a bunch of men in the room, you get one-sided problem solving. And if you only have a bunch of women in the room, you get one-sided problem solving. And imagine the magic that happens when you have a team with diverse perspectives. So not only gender, but then people coming from all walks of life, right? Whether it's socioeconomic or people of color, or people, in terms of sexual orientation, like everybody's brain, thinks differently from lived experiences too. But the differences they talked about with problem solving for men and women specifically are that men come to a problem and look at it in engineering and look at it structurally. What's the strongest way, most affordable, quickest way we're going to build this? And the women were coming to the table and saying, first, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And then we'll figure out the structure.
Wow.
And so to have those two working together, right, makes for pretty strong problem solving. And so that's what they were finding in their research is one example of how we problem solve differently. It's just when it's a homogenous group of people problem solving, you probably don't get the strongest solution. So it was pretty cool. Back
to your pathway, can you talk about some challenges that you've faced?
Some of it is actually age related. I moved so quickly, what people would describe as, up the ranks. And I present younger than I actually am. I'm almost 50.
Okay, I'm sorry, but you do not look 50 in your photographs. And I need to know your skincare routine. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, I will be 49 this year.
Wow.
And the picture you've seen, I mean, they took that picture when I got to Washington STEM. If it's like when I'm wearing the red or different. Yeah. That's a new picture. And that has become a challenge. And so, I never thought age discrimination would be an issue in terms of being younger than I look. I always thought of age discrimination as looking older than people would expect. And so, just having people being a bit patronizing, like, well, oh, sweetie, like, you wouldn't have known about that. I'm like, really? Because I'm like 48 years old. They're like, what? Yeah, I was born in the early 70s. I do know about that. So that's been a big thing. The other piece too, and you guys have heard all of this, is fighting for my pay, fighting for the right salary. I will counter every time somebody gives me an offer because they're going to lowball me. And I do my research and I know my value, and money isn't everything. But when I'm negotiating at that table, you're going to give me what I'm worth. So they still talk about women earning, 76 cents on the dollar. And if you disaggregate it, African-American women, earn even less in Hispanic, Latinx women, and so on and so on and so on. And so, that's the piece that has really hit me where, I'm always surprised because I want to think the best of people, but that's been a challenge as a female for sure.
Part of equity is access. Have you had challenges around access to jobs that you wanted?
Honestly, I haven't, and that's because I learned early on that access is based on who you know. Unfortunately, it's not fair, but it's still reality. And so when I've thought about like, what's your next goal? And it's like, you know what, how do you need to expand your network so that people understand your worth and what you could bring to the table? And so I've definitely worked, my father told me, it was one of the greatest pieces of advice he gave me when I left for college. He said, Angela, you need to get to know your professors. And I was 17 when I left for college. I'm like, and I nodded, yes, Dad. And in my head, I'm like, I'm not talking to those old people. I don't want to talk to a stupid professor. I just want to take my notes and go home. But he planted that seed and it stayed with me because he said, you will need them later. And as a 17-year-old, I didn't understand that. And as I worked through college and realized, somebody's got to write me a letter of recommendation. Somebody has to be willing to be my reference. And if I haven't made connections with some of these faculty or staff, who am I going to ask? I kept that going even beyond college. Like, if I want to be a president or vice president one day, I've got to have people who are willing to vouch for me. And then also I've gone to people and said, like, I need to know what you know. When I was in law school, I was one of the oldest students at Gonzaga Law, which was hilarious. But I decided to join the Student Bar Associations of the student government, and I was the diversity chair. And I had a great opportunity. The Washington State Supreme Court travels around and holds oral arguments in different places. And so they used Gonzaga's courtroom. And while they were there, two of the justices, Justice Mary Yu and Justice Stephen Gonzalez, said, we would like to talk to law students of color. And so the law school reached out to me and said, Angela, you're the chair of the diversity committee. Can you please bring, some students to meet with them? It'll only be 20 minutes. I'm like, cool, great, I got it. They came and talked to us. I introduced them. People asked questions. I closed it. Directly following, I sent them a note on behalf of the students at Gonzaga, thanking them. And the following week, I get stopped by a professor in the hallway. And she says, oh, by the way, the Justice, you told the dean that you're her next intern. I was like, excuse me? And she said, yeah, she said, you're her next intern at the Supreme Court. So you need to go talk to the dean. I was like, why would she want me to be her next intern? She doesn't know me. She was with me 20 minutes. And she said, she told the dean she just knows when she knows. And that's how I got to be a legal extern for Justice Mary Yu at the Washington State Supreme Court. And so it's those connections. Then she introduced me to many other people, right? And when I sat down with her, I called and I said, I'd like to meet with you. I'll come over to Seattle because I want to understand what you're asking me to do. And I sat down with her and I said, why did you pick me? I am not a good student. I am a single mom. I am barely keeping it together. And I believe C's to get degrees right now. And she said, you bring something to the table. I could tell with your leadership, you bring something to the table that I could use in my chambers. And she says, what do you want from me? I said, I want you to teach me how to be a better legal writer. And I need you to open your network. And she said, agreed, done. I can do both. And she did, and that's so important for people to be willing, especially females, to advocate for themselves and to ask for what they need. I always believe a closed mouth doesn't get fed. And it's not fair. But it's true. And so for some people who don't feel like they have that voice, that's the other thing that I'm passionate about. How am I that voice for other people who haven't yet grown that voice yet? They're still working on it.
Why don't women advocate for themselves?
I think, again, I don't want to generalize, but sometimes, we get bit by the flames when we try. And I just happen to be one who will just come right back around and go, it wasn't a bad burn. Let me ask it again in a different way. But a lot of people have been burned and beat down by the different systems that make up our environments and our work environments. And so I think that's been a challenge. Once you get that PTSD, I just am wired a totally different way to keep coming back. And they think like, okay, that didn't work. Now look back at that obstacle and figure out how you're going to get around it, under it, through it, over it. But there's a way. I always feel like there's a way. It may take longer.
I think it's so important for women to hear you say that, because I'm imagining that for many women, not having the voice and not being reticent to speak up possibly comes from a lack of vision for access. If you don't think you're going to have a chance, if there's no chance, why make the effort?
You are absolutely right. But I also want to say that I think we have a responsibility, those of us who have made it through other doors, to keep that door open. And so once we get through that door, like I'm a CEO, and so I can't stop and be like, hey, look at that, I'm a CEO. May the force be with the rest of you who were trying to get to this seat. Like, it was a rough road, but guess what? You could do it, and then not explain how, and not share my ups and my downs. And so I'm trying to do that now, where I was thinking about that when I was vice president. I said, Angela, you have literally groomed nobody to come behind you. So I've taken on a couple of women, and even during these tough times in a pandemic, I've learned so much about my leadership. And I've been sharing that with some of these young women to say, hey, just as you're learning, here's how I address the pandemic with my team. Here's an email that might help you. And they're like, oh, well, we've never thought about it that way. So I've also started writing a blog just to share my experiences, because nobody, there's no school on being a CEO. And there's certainly no school on being a CEO and leading through a pandemic. And so I'm trying to memorialize what I'm learning so that people can benefit from it, not just me. It's certainly trial and error some days.
If you'd be willing, talk about one of the biggest challenges you've had to face in your journey.
Wow, what is my biggest challenge? I'll be honest with you, Joshua. The way my mind is set, the way my parents raised me, I have never looked at anything and went, ugh, that's huge. My mindset, like, I immediately go to, okay, now what's the plan, Angela? And so there's not one thing. I mean, I think for most people, it's just being able to keep that vision, keep your eyes on the prize, right? I actually wrote a personal strategic plan, and it's had many iterations. It started out with, I folded back in the day, we had the color goldenrod, paper that we always use, right? And I folded it in squares, and I wrote something in each square, like London, like I wanted to visit London, buy a house, get your PhD, buy a Jaguar, get a husband, have kids, get a dog. Like, all of that was on this list. And I edited it over time. And then sat down again this past year to just rewrite and say, okay, now that you're, heading towards 50, what does that mean for you with your job, with your relationships, with your health? What does that mean? And so I honestly have never looked at anything and said, I can't do it. I've always looked at things and said, sometimes even like, that's cute, but that's not going to stop me. Or, God, that sucks, but that's not going to stop me. And that really, I think the context for that is my parents have really reminded me how far generations of my family have come. We know the name of the last slave in our family. We know, both of my parents grew up in abject poverty. Like, my dad having a house with 11 people in 2 bedrooms, my mom being from the Philippines, no running water, no electricity, like those kinds of things. She had to share shoes with her sister. Like, there are days that she got the shoes to go to school, and there are days her sister got the shoes to go to school.
Wow.
And to think, like, I've never had to face that. So anything else that I'm dealing with here, like, suck it up, Angela, figure it out. You have a right to be tired. You have a right to be upset. You have a right to be scared. You have a right to be angry. You have a right to rest when all of those things are happening. You don't have the right to quit, because too many people before me have just paved the way super hardcore so that I could be a brown CEO at the table. And so that's why it's really hard for me to answer that question. Life has happened. I've had a tumor. I've broken my leg. I've had a fracture. Those things slowed me down and they got in my way. I've gotten divorced. They haven't necessarily, I've not necessarily looked at them as challenges. I just think it's all in perspective. So, earlier I said, like, it's incumbent upon us to help bring people forward. I've had several mentors along the way, and I was trying to think about what's different that my female mentors did for me. And I'll tell you, my boss before this, the president at Eastern Washington University, I'd been working for her 6 months as her chief of staff. And we were traveling for work, and we were early, to our appointment. So we said, let's go get breakfast. So we're sitting down, we get our food, and she says, when we get done eating, I want to talk to you about your future. And I'm like, I just started working for you. Are you firing me or what is happening here? She says, no, just eat and we'll talk. So we ate. And then finally she says, you need to be a president. And I said, excuse me? I just started like literally 6 months working for you as your chief. She says, yeah, but I can see it in you. You have what it takes to be a university president. And I said, okay, that's great. And she said, so I'm going to start giving you experiences. She said, you need to help me manage the university budget. There's a finance team that does the big part of it, but she's got to look it over, make recommendations, approve. And she's like, you're going to be the one to do the presentations to the university. You're going to be the one to approve things, but I'm going to give you that experience, and I'm going to give you even more experience with policy. And then she says, and I'm going to pay for you to go to an executive training camp for executives of color. And she did. And she didn't, I'm getting emotional. She didn't have to invest in me after knowing me for only 6 months. And mind you, she hired me after I was unemployed for 2 years because I was in law school. And then takes me on and says, I'm going to invest in you. And so when I left Eastern, it was an emotional departure where it's just like, she and I had teamed up. We had done some great things together, but I said, but this is what you taught me to do. This is the next step. And so it's things like that where I'm like, okay, how do I pay that forward? She invested in me. How do I invest in the next person? Because it is hard to get to this seat at the table for women. And so that I think is really important for us to remember and ask ourselves who we're investing in besides our own goals with that.
Wow. What are you most hopeful about for the future of women in leadership, and maybe the future of women leadership in STEM more specifically?
I'm pretty excited that as I'm talking to more young girls, they can see themselves in STEM now as we're having these conversations. And I've done some Zoom classrooms calls with people, and more girls are reaching out to me. And I love that, they see me as the CEO of Washington STEM, and it's like, oh,
right.
Well, if that's what somebody in STEM looks like, that could be me. We're even featuring, my comms team has been featuring notable women in STEM.
I looked at
to try
that.
to do that same thing. Yeah, and those are Washington-based women. We're trying to say, like, look, kids, like these are people right here who do all these crazy things. And I have a lot of hope. I actually spoke to the Waterworks Association at their conference here, and I was in a room with about 300 female engineers.
Oh, wow.
And it was the craziest and most amazing feeling to look out at an audience, and it is all female, all STEM. And so that gives me hope. And they're organizing to say, we need more women in the ranks. And I've talked to them all about the same thing that we just spoke about. Like, you guys have to help me make connections, because, these students are struggling through the classes. How do we help them? How do we help them, be resilient, have that grit to just, finish and get through? And then once they do, how do we help them be prepared for the interview? And then how do we help them stay in that workplace that hasn't quite adjusted for them yet? And so it does give me hope, all different things that are happening, and the school systems are trying to do things differently. The progress is slow, but I won't say that there's no progress. And so I always have hope that we're moving in the right direction. And even, as we hear about, the student experience that Trace and her family have at North Central, how do we do more of that? Because when I did go into North Central, I did see females in that space, and I was pretty excited about that too. So how do we continue to make that normal and not me surprised when I walk in and go, oh, there's a girl, great. Getting closer to that as we keep talking about in the pandemic, the new normal, how do we make that the new normal, that you're just used to seeing a diverse group of people in those STEM spaces. So all the work that I'm privy to, that I get to help fund as I'm working with education and even the corporate sector, what's important to them, all of the stuff that we're talking about is important to them. And so being able to partner and spread that a little bit further and help change minds and hearts around that work. So I do have a lot of hope, even on the days that I'm tired.
Can you comment on your perspective on how we can increase access to leadership positions? You've said mentoring and paving the way behind you. And I've said this a couple of times on the podcast, but recent numbers around Fortune 500 companies are that it's sitting right around 95% are helmed by men. And so how do we, on a big scale, affect that for women?
That is definitely a really tough nut to crack, and I've actually been studying that as well. I even went to an event about getting more women on corporate boards as well. There's very few women are on corporate boards, especially in Fortune 500 companies. And so what we've talked about is how do we support each other through those processes and get more than one of us on boards together, for example. And so the same would be, some of these companies, corporate environment's very different. And so, but all that to say too, I wouldn't even just stick with the Fortune 500 companies. When you look at universities, so, and here's an example, Eastern Washington University is now 137 years old. Their first female president, it took 134 years to get their first female president. Right? So even there, and it's not that women are not applying, it's who gets to make the rules, who gets to select, right? Who's sitting in as trustees, who's sitting on these boards, because the boards are the ones that hire the executives, right? And so my board, when they hired me, they made a concerted effort to say, we want a diverse pool of candidates. We really want to be intentional about having a diverse pool of candidates, because if we say we want to have access for all these, priority populations, how are we not doing the same thing when we're hiring our new CEO? So my board was very intentional. And so, how you're moving hearts to get people to that place, but that has to come from the leadership. And that has to come from the board. So that's the challenge, is how do you get different people with open mindsets in those spaces? How do you make getting a corporate job not the bad thing to do? In some communities, people want to say, well, Angela, you work for this organization that's, corporate funded and you're a sellout. Or I'm a systems thinker who likes to actually work within the system to change it. And so shifting that mindset too about what it means for you to jump into those roles. I've always been one that was like, I'm not throwing rocks at the giant. I'm going to be the giant on the inside, and I'm going to change hearts. And there is the need for the throwing the rocks at the giant, but that can't be our only tool in the tool belt. We've got to be inside the giant too, and be a decision maker within the giant. And so that's what it's going to take to shift that. More people inside who are able to say, hey, look at our hiring practices. Because it's not that people aren't applying. It's how do we pick and who's picking? And if we have a homogenous group of people picking, they're going to pick people who remind them of themselves. So those are some of the strategies we've been thinking about and even talking about in our own protocols. Even at Washington STEM, we've changed our protocols a lot so that we're trying to have less bias in how we hire.
Is that where no gap gazing comes in?
No gap gazing actually means, we see the data and we see the gap and we don't just stare at it and go, oh, there's a gap.
Okay.
Like, no, we jump in the gap. Okay, let's look at this. Let's analyze this. And now let's bring folks together to find the solution to close this and sustain the closure.
Got it. Don't just look at it and go, oh, that's a problem.
Right.
Roll up your sleeves and fix it.
Yeah. Like right now, riots are a problem.
Yes.
Like, what are we going to do about that? Like, systemic racism is a problem. What are we going to do about that? I have a lot of friends who keep calling and saying, what should we do? What should we do? And I'm like, here's 75 things you can think about right now. And they're like, oh, didn't expect
work?
that.
I have to work?
Yeah. Like each one of us has something we can do. Like your work here right now, you're exposing the experiences that women have, right? you're sharing that out, and somebody who's listening about this, you're providing a voice, and somebody's going to hear it and take at least one nugget, out of a podcast, and probably many nuggets. And so you're actually physically doing something. You could have thought about the issues around, female leadership. You could have thought about it all day long and not, but you took another step, because this takes work.
Yes.
Like, you're going to have to edit all of this and have it all make sense. This is work, and I recognize that. So, and you've been talking to me for months to prepare for today, right? That's the work that has to be put in. So you're right, Trace, it does take work.
Thanks to Angela Jones for chatting with us on Taking Her Lead. I am so glad we got to talk with her. And I want everyone to please take note. Our episodes drop every second Tuesday. And we now have a link to Patreon on our website, takingherlead.blueberry, BLUBRRY.net. And keep in mind that any contribution you make goes towards our operating costs and helps us reach out to more women in leadership and provide more programming for you. So we appreciate all the help that you give.
Very much. You can also find us on LinkedIn, just under Taking Her Lead. And we're on Twitter at @her_taking. And of course, we're on iTunes. And if you find us there, please rate, review, and give us 5 stars if you feel we deserve it. We think we do.
Yeah.
That really helps get the word out there and promote our mission and promote the women, these amazing women we are getting the chance to interview as guests on the podcast.
Our theme music is composed by Emily Lau, and the beautiful logo that you see when you click on us on iTunes was designed by our creative director, Elizabeth Pierce.
For all those women who are in leadership and all those who want to be, our hats off to you. This is Joshua Everett Mayer.
And this is Trace Kerr.
Talk to you soon.